And we'll get into that in the bakery. Ultimately, you're trying to achieve a very, very film-like structure. And think about that, that protein, right? We can make it or we can break it, that gluten. We can undermix, we can overmix. So it is in our hands, the raw material. People think, oh, mixing, no problem. It's so easy to make bread. You know, just throw the ingredients in the mixer, turn it on, and we mix 2 minutes on slow speed or 4 minutes on slow speed, 6 minutes on high speed. That's good, finished, right? But there are signs you should look for when you're mixing. Because if bakeries are warmer, right? Maybe we should, as bakers, mix a little bit less, right? Because warmer doughs need less time. Okay, all types of additives that you may or may not be putting on at your bakery in a form of an improver, or that the mill is adding. But regardless, whatever is being put on at the mill and at the bakery has to make that flour work for you. And so NAMILCO does understand, right, what your challenges are, and they treat the flour for you. They put additives, vitamin C, nothing harmful, vitamin C. This will bring oxygen to the dough that I mentioned. And actually, you're very fortunate in Guyana, because I have worked in many markets where the mill does not put additives on the flour. And it's up to the responsibility of the baker to put additives on the flour. Whether it's an improver or whether it's a large production plant that puts them on individually, works directly with an enzyme or additive supplier, right? So they are also absorbing that cost. And ascorbic acid is not cheap, especially compared to former additives in the market. So you have a big advantage. Your flour is ready to work with. You don't have to figure it out relative to what additives, what enzymes will work best. I mean, the yeast, right? All of you are baking with yeast, right? The condition of that yeast is important. The type of yeast, how you mix in the yeast, right? There are many, many variables in baking that are actually very easy to control if we take these steps or use these steps. And they will impact the end quality in your product. I'm not sure if you realize, but yeast will be killed at 50 degrees. That should actually say Celsius, not Fahrenheit, sorry. There is no more enzymatic action going on with yeast. So think about that, how warm the temperatures here and our dough temperatures, right? If we go beyond that, we have lots of problems. And we'll get into this in the bakery. So fermentation is a whole process, right? There's a lot of things happening. Actually, baking is a whole biochemical, enzymatic process, right? Where a lot of things are happening that we as bakers may not fully understand, okay? But there's lots going on. But what's important for you to know is that yeast, right? Even instant yeast dry that you're using here is a living organism, okay? And you can kill it, okay, if we don't handle it properly. What do we need the yeast for? How do we get volume? How do we get flavor? Right, so we have to treat the yeast very carefully. And that doesn't mean you take the yeast and put it somewhere special. That means you have to be aware of that when you're mixing your doughs and thinking about the dough temperature. Because very hot dough temperatures can kill it. And of course, there's a whole pH system in place for baking, okay? And sometimes, I'm not sure if you yourselves may have had the experience to taste doughs that are very tangy or very sour. Sometimes the dough gets old, right? Something broke down in the bakery and we have to let the dough wait. We have no choice. Okay, so all these things are going on in our dough, right? The pH is changing as time passes. And there are things that we as bakers can do to control that, because the optimum pH is between 4 and 6. Okay, so if the dough temperature goes too high, we have a problem. And too low, too cold is also a problem. But I don't think you have to worry about too cold here. Is that right? In Canada, sometimes we do, right? We have very cold winters, and we also have to adjust our baking on the month. So we have to always try as bakers to continually learn more about what we do, learn more about the raw material, learn more about our processes, learn more about ingredients. I have so much to learn myself still, and I'm sure it will never, ever stop. So that's important, right? Because that will allow you to run your bakery well. When I was thinking what to do for this demo in Guyana, I had to really figure out what your challenges were, and we discussed them in my presentation. But visiting different bakeries and speaking with different managers, it seems to me that there is a lot of question on the absorption on flour and how much water the dough or the flour can hold. Okay, and of course, bakers' #1 interest, okay, outside of consistent flour, is the absorption, right? We all want to put as much water as we can, or we should want to put as much water as we can, because the more water we put in the dough, the greater yield, right? The more money in your pockets. So some things in Guyana that I've noticed in the time that I've been here is, of course, the formula is very different. The formula changes, as I say, from bakery to bakery, but the range is quite drastic. The water, for example, varies in this market between 50 and 60%. That's a lot. 10% difference on the same flour. Bakers are using 50 and or 60%. 10%. That's a lot. Think about if a bag of flour costs you 10% less. That's a lot. What if it costs you 10% more? That's a lot, right? So 10%, from my point of view, is a lot, okay, to keep in mind. The sugar content, of course, varies in the market, anywhere between 8 and 12. And we're talking pan bread now, okay? I recognize that tennis rolls, other products take more sugar, formula is different, but we're talking pan bread, okay? So that also varies. And that, of course, has impact on how much water you can put in, okay? Lloyd, go ahead and start mixing, if you don't mind. Thanks. So Lloyd is using the flour. We're using 100-pound bag, okay? And the formula is very similar to all of yours. We're not using a special formula here today. We're using a typical Guyanese pan bread formula. So it's flour, water, salt, sugar, shortening, and yeast. And one of the things that Lloyd is doing now is brown sugar. That's one thing I learned in Guyana, that you only use brown sugar for baking. I didn't realize that. Salt, okay. I didn't realize that, but so that was a good learning thing for me. And when Lloyd scales the yeast now, is what he's going to do. Okay, we're going to put the yeast like on one side of the mixer. We're not going to let the yeast really come into contact with the salt. Remember what I told you about the yeast? Okay, it will become a living organism. We don't want it touching really the salt or the sugar. So when you're doing your scaling in your bakeries, you know, it's so easy just to throw it on top of each other and everything, but it's better if you put the yeast in on a different, oh no, the shortening, we keep it out. We're going to do something a little different today. Like yesterday, we're going to do that. So you just keep going ahead. Lloyd is an excellent mixer. He's pulling all the weight here, I must say. I have the easy job. So the brown sugar, just to let you know, okay, because maybe you're so used to that, is that using brown sugar is much healthier for your bread because it is not refined. So that's one very positive thing for your customers. And I must tell you, in Canada and many markets around the world, they only use white refined sugar. Only white. In Canada, we only use white refined sugar. Okay, it's not as healthy. Actually, we could learn from you relative to using brown sugar. But one thing it does impact, of course, using brown sugar is the color, right? So if everything is more white going into the flour, right? The flour, we want a nice color, we want certain characteristics on the flour, then that's one thing we have to keep in mind, right? We are, as bakers, by using brown sugar, influencing the color. So it's healthier. If color's not a big issue, great. But in some markets, they would never entertain the idea of using brown sugar simply because they want the bread so very white, and that will impact that. Okay, so it's personal preference. Every country, every market is different. I think personally, it's good to use. I'd rather have darker crumb color and use healthier ingredients. So I think that's a great thing. In this market, salt. When we put salt. Lloyd, is everything in the mixer but the shortening? Yeah. Okay. So Lloyd has told me everything's in the mixer but the shortening. And just for interest, what we're doing here, we've got 100 pounds of flour. Okay. We use 1 pound of salt. Right. We use 10 pounds of sugar. 10 pounds of sugar. We used 5 pounds of shortening. Okay, we used 200 grams of yeast. And we used 60 pounds of water. Now, one thing you notice here is that we didn't put the shortening in right away, right? Most people, and I also have, in my own bakery, put the shortening in when we're mixing. But ideally, it's much better if you delay the shortening, okay? Because what happens is shortening is a fat, right? And it's very greasy. It coats the gluten, the protein. So what happens when you put fat on top of flour? The water will not get absorbed